My name is Jessica Morgan, and I am in my early 30s. I have never told my family that I own a billion-dollar empire. Not because I was afraid and not because I was hiding, but because I wanted to know one thing first: how they would treat me if they truly believed I was a failure. To them, I was the one who never made it, the one whose life stalled, while everyone else moved forward, the one they quietly stopped expecting anything from. So when they invited me to a celebration dinner honoring my older sister's promotion to CEO, I accepted without correcting a single assumption. The moment I stepped into that upscale steakhouse, I understood exactly why they wanted me there. The table was already arranged, every seat accounted for, every glass carefully placed, except there was no seat prepared for me. When a server glanced in my direction, someone calmly said I would not need a drink menu. No raised voices, no insults. Just a quiet decision that I did not belong at the center of the table. I was there to watch, not to participate. I was there to serve as a contrast, a reminder of what success looks like and what failure becomes. I felt it in the way conversations paused when I approached, in the way questions were asked, without waiting for answers, in the way my presence was tolerated but never welcomed. I could have ended it right then. I could have spoken up, corrected every lie they believed about me, and walked out with the truth exposed. Instead, I pulled out a chair, sat down, and stayed silent. I wanted to see how far they would go when they thought I had nothing to lose. What happened next did not stop at that dinner, and once the line was crossed, there was no way back. If you want to see how this unfolded and why I chose to walk away for good, make sure you stay with me and subscribe. The dinner continued as if the hierarchy in that room had already been agreed upon long before anyone sat down. Conversation flowed effortlessly toward my older sister, returning to her again and again, with an ease that suggested this was exactly how the night was meant to unfold. Every detail of her promotion was examined and admired, not just the title itself, but the authority behind it, the influence she now carried, the number of people whose careers were shaped by her decisions. Each compliment stacked neatly on top of the last, forming a careful narrative about leadership, ambition, and inevitability, as though her success had been written into the family's story from the start. My parents leaned fully into that narrative, their pride unmistakable, speaking about her future as something secure and earned proof that discipline and the right choices always led to recognition. They spoke in broad, confident statements, framing her achievements as a reflection of the values they believed defined our family, and no one at the table questioned that framing or offered an alternative perspective. I noticed how the attention followed her naturally, how people waited for her to finish speaking before responding, how glasses were lifted in her direction without prompting, how pauses in conversation seemed to hold until she continued. When she talked about responsibility and leadership, her words were accepted without challenge, not because they were flawless, but because she was now positioned as someone whose certainty carried weight. Respect moved through the room, quietly attached to status rather than substance, and it granted her uninterrupted space. Her fiancé navigated the table with practiced ease, greeting certain guests warmly while offering only minimal acknowledgement to others, his interest clearly measured and deliberate. When he spoke to me, his tone was polite, but distant, the kind of courtesy that fulfilled a social obligation without inviting connection. His questions were brief and unfocused, and before I could finish answering, his attention drifted back toward conversations he considered more worthwhile. He did not pause to hear the rest of my response, and he did not notice when I stopped speaking. At one point, someone asked what I had been doing lately, the question delivered softly, almost apologetically, as if it existed only because manners required it. Before my sentence could settle, the discussion shifted back to leadership challenges, industry expectations, and the pressure that came with being at the top. No one interrupted to bring me back in. No one looked to see if I had more to add. The table adjusted seamlessly around the assumption that my contribution was complete, even though it had barely begun. What became increasingly clear was that nothing about this dynamic was accidental. Decisions about who mattered were being made without words, reinforced through timing, eye contact, and attention. My parents did not need to criticize me directly to establish my position. Their focus, their enthusiasm, and their praise communicated everything that needed to be said. Success was rewarded with space, patience, and validation, while failure was quietly edged toward the margins. The system worked efficiently without raised voices or overt cruelty, and that efficiency made it feel justified. I stayed quiet not because I was stunned, but because I understood what I was witnessing. This was not a single moment of exclusion or an awkward lapse in etiquette. It was a pattern that had settled into place long ago, one that ranked people automatically and treated those rankings as natural. No one at that table appeared uncomfortable with the arrangement. No one questioned it. The ease with which everyone accepted their roles made the imbalance feel permanent, as though it required no explanation. As the dinner continued, the distance between where I sat and where I belonged in their eyes widened without resistance, reinforced by every conversation that moved forward without me and every assumption that went unchallenged. I was not being ignored by mistake. I was being placed exactly where they believed I belonged, and the quiet certainty of that belief settled heavily over the table. The shift happened quietly, almost politely, when my mother redirected the conversation with the ease of someone who believed she was being reasonable. She did not announce the change or draw attention to it. She simply began talking about me as if it were the next logical topic. Her tone calm and composed the way people speak when they think they are being fair. She referenced my choices, my path, and how things had turned out differently than expected, framing it all as context rather than criticism, as though she were helping others understand a situation that no longer needed debate. There was no bitterness in her voice, only certainty, and that certainty carried weight because she believed it was earned. My father followed seamlessly, his words measured and deliberate, speaking as if he were clarifying a misunderstanding rather than delivering a judgment. He said the family had learned to adjust their expectations not out of disappointment, but out of realism, explaining that they had stopped waiting for a version of my life that never arrived. According to him, some people move forward, others plateau, and accepting that difference was part of being honest. The way he said it made it clear that this conclusion was not new. It had been discussed, agreed upon, and settled long before this dinner. The statement landed with finality, not because it was harsh, but because it was presented as resolved. What made the moment unsettling was how they spoke about me without addressing me, using my name in the third person, describing my life as though I were absent, outlining my limitations as if they were established facts. They avoided my eyes not out of discomfort, but because they did not need my response to validate their perspective. Others at the table listened without interruption, their expressions neutral, accepting the narrative as complete. No one challenged the framing, no one asked whether I saw things differently, and no one seemed curious about what I might say. Once the label was placed, the conversation adjusted around it effortlessly. With my role defined, there was no longer any need to ask about my ambitions or future plans. The assumption that I had already reached my ceiling settled into the room, providing a sense of order that everyone appeared comfortable with. The absence of hostility made it harder to confront because there was nothing to push against. No insult to reject, only a calm declaration of who they believed I was. I did not interrupt or defend myself, not because I agreed, but because I recognized that any response would only serve to disrupt a version of reality they were invested in maintaining. Their words were not an invitation to reconsider or explain. They were a confirmation of a decision already made. Silence in that moment was not submission, it was clarity. As they continued speaking with quiet confidence, I understood that this was no longer about disappointment or concern, it was about definition. They had reduced my life to a single conclusion and spoke with the assurance of people who believed they were finally being honest. In their minds, this was not dismissal, but understanding, and that belief allowed them to speak freely, certain they were right. I sat there fully present, fully aware, listening to my life being summarized without my consent, knowing that once a label like that is spoken aloud and accepted by everyone in the room, it becomes something fixed, something far more difficult to undo. Not long after the conversation settled into its comfortable rhythm, my mother leaned forward with a composed expression that signaled she was about to say something important, something she clearly believed was necessary. She spoke calmly, almost gently, explaining that she had been thinking a great deal about my situation and that the family agreed it was time to be proactive rather than passive. According to her, drifting without direction was not freedom, it was risk, and allowing that risk to continue would be irresponsible on their part. She framed what followed as a solution, not an intervention, emphasizing that this was about helping me regain stability, not changing who I was. The plan unfolded piece by piece, delivered slowly and carefully as though the pacing itself made it reasonable. She explained that a position had been identified for me, something modest and manageable connected directly to my older sister's organization, so expectations would be clear and supervision would be consistent. It was not meant to be challenging or ambitious, just reliable, a role that would give me structure without pressure and prevent further missteps. She described it as a temporary measure, a way to keep me grounded while I figured out what came next, and she repeated that dependence was not permanent, just practical. Then she shifted to where I lived, suggesting that relocating closer to family would make everything easier, not because I was incapable, but because proximity allowed support to function properly. Being nearby would reduce stress, simplify logistics, and ensure I was not making decisions in isolation. She spoke as if this were obvious, as if independence without oversight was a problem that needed correcting. My father reinforced her reasoning, adding that this was not about control, but about accountability, about creating a system where mistakes could be caught early rather than allowed to compound. He said that at this stage in life, stability mattered more than pride, and accepting guidance was often the smartest move. His tone carried no doubt, only conviction, as though refusing such an offer would be reckless. My older sister did not speak, but her silence functioned as approval, her position alone, lending authority to the plan. Then her fiancé stepped in, shifting the conversation from suggestion to implementation by placing a thin folder on the table between us. He explained that it was not a contract, just a formality meant to clarify expectations so there would be no misunderstandings later. Clear boundaries, he said, protected everyone involved, and signatures were simply a way to keep things transparent and professional. The paper itself was unremarkable, but its presence changed the dynamic instantly. No one asked whether I agreed with what had been proposed. No one paused to check how I felt. The plan was discussed as though it already existed, as though my role was simply to comply. What made the moment unsettling was the sincerity behind it all. They were not angry. They were not cruel. They genuinely believed they were helping me, that this was the responsible and compassionate thing to do. Their certainty left no space for discussion, because from their perspective, disagreement would only prove their point. As I listened, everything narrowed into a moment of clarity where only two options remained. I could stand up, refuse, and walk away, ending the conversation, and likely severing whatever version of family connection they believed still existed, or I could stay seated and let them finish, allowing their version of my future to take shape without resistance. I understood the cost of both choices immediately. Leaving would mark me as ungrateful and irrational. Staying would quietly confirm their authority over my life. I looked at the folder, then at the faces around the table, calm and confident, convinced of their own good intentions. I did not argue. I did not ask for time. I did not explain myself. I stayed where I was and said nothing. My silence was interpreted exactly as they needed it to be, not as refusal, but as acceptance. Relief moved through the table, tension dissolving as though something difficult had been handled correctly. The conversation lightened, voices relaxed, and they moved on satisfied that the situation had been addressed. I remained still, fully aware that a line had just been crossed, not loudly or aggressively, but with a quiet certainty that made it impossible to ignore, knowing that what had just happened could never be undone. As the tension from the earlier discussion settled, the conversation pivoted smoothly towards something that immediately commanded respect, an organization whose name shifted the mood at the table without effort. My older sister spoke with deliberate care, explaining that a major decision was approaching, one that would affect not only her position, but the trajectory of an entire operation, and the way she described it made clear how rare and consequential it was. This was not framed as speculation, but as proximity to power, a moment that required discretion, credibility, and approval from people who rarely involved themselves directly. My parents leaned in, their interest sharpened, asking thoughtful questions about influence, timing, and reputation, their tone changing as the subject moved from family dynamics to something they clearly considered important. Her fiancé added context with confidence, emphasizing how selective the organization was, how few people were ever considered, and how a single decision from the right place could alter careers overnight. The name itself carried authority, drawing admiration, without needing justification, and everyone at the table spoke about it with measured respect, lowering their voices slightly, as though acknowledging power even when it was not present. They praised its leadership, its restraint, and its ability to operate quietly, the kind of influence that shaped outcomes without public attention. As they talked, I felt a familiar clarity settle in, the kind that comes when you recognize something others do not. I knew exactly what they were discussing, not abstractly, but in precise detail. The decision they described, the approval they anticipated, and the authority they revered all existed within my control. Every outcome they speculated about, every possibility they weighed, was tied to choices I handled routinely without ceremony or acknowledgement. The irony was sharp, but I did not smile. I understood immediately that revealing the truth in that moment would do more than shock them, it would fracture something carefully constructed. The organization operated behind deliberate layers, not to appear mysterious, but to remain protected, and identities were separated from decisions for legal, strategic, and ethical reasons. Exposing my role in a setting charged with emotion and assumption would create risks that extended far beyond personal relationships, compromising negotiations, breaching confidentiality, and collapsing boundaries that existed for good reason. Power, when exercised responsibly, required restraint. I stayed silent while they continued listening as they praised judgment and discretion, without realizing they were describing the very principles guiding my choices. My parents spoke admiringly about the people behind the organization, remarking on how impressive it was to hold influence without seeking recognition, calling it integrity, calling it leadership done correctly. My older sister discussed potential outcomes with careful optimism, aligning them with her ambitions, confident that proximity and timing were working in her favor. Her fiancé nodded along, assured and composed, speaking as though alignment was inevitable, as though approval was simply a matter of process. No one looked toward me because in their minds I was not part of this conversation, not someone whose perspective mattered, and that assumption allowed me to observe without interruption. I was acutely aware that timing mattered more than revelation, that information carried weight only when released correctly, and that silence in this moment was not avoidance, but responsibility. If I spoke now, I would turn a controlled reality into chaos, replacing strategy with spectacle. As they continued, I realized how complete the divide had become between who they believed I was and who I actually was. They trusted my judgment without knowing it belonged to me. They respected authority without recognizing its presence at the table. The power they spoke about so openly remained hidden in plain sight, not because it was invisible, but because they had already decided where I fit, and that decision blinded them to everything else. Not long after the dinner began to dissolve into small talk, the atmosphere shifted in a way that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with information. My father was the first to notice rereading a message on his phone before setting it down and glancing toward my sister with a question he did not yet voice. She checked her screen, then another, her expression tightening as notifications continued to arrive, each one pulling her further away from the confidence she had carried all evening. Her fiancé stepped aside to answer a call, his tone low and professional, but his posture changed, shoulders, rigid movements precise, the body language of someone recalculating. My mother followed suit, scanning an email with a growing sense of unease, asking quietly whether this update was expected, and my sister admitted that it was not, that the decision they had been counting on had been paused without explanation. The word paused landed heavily because everything they had discussed assumed momentum, certainty, and alignment. Within minutes, it became clear that this was not an isolated delay, but part of a broader reassessment, one that extended beyond a single opportunity and into areas none of them controlled. As they tried to piece together fragments of incomplete information, a man approached the table with measured confidence, neither rushed nor hesitant, carrying himself with the ease of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. He introduced himself briefly as an authorized representative, explained that the timing was unfortunate but necessary, and acknowledged the gathering with polite restraint before turning his full attention toward me. When he spoke, he addressed me by my full name, enunciated clearly, followed immediately by a formal title that redefined the space around us without raising his voice. The effect was immediate. He spoke as though we were continuing an existing dialogue, referencing established authority, prior oversight, and ongoing discretion, confirming that a pending matter required my review before any further movement could occur. There was no announcement, no reveal, only confirmation, and that distinction mattered. My sister stared at him, then at me, struggling to reconcile what she was hearing with the version of me she had relied on, and when she asked who he was referring to, he repeated my full name and clarified my role within the organization they had spent the evening praising. No one interrupted him. No one questioned his credentials. The silence that followed was not disbelief, but recalibration, the sound of assumptions collapsing under the weight of verified reality. My parents did not ask whether it was true, they asked how long, and when he answered without hesitation, stating that my position had been in place for years, the implications settled fully. This was not sudden success or a fortunate break. It was continuity, responsibility, and authority that predated every judgment they had made. The representative explained that recent developments required confidentiality, that all communication would proceed through formal channels, and that nothing further could be discussed in a social setting. He thanked me for my time, acknowledged the table with professional courtesy, and left without waiting for a response, as though the matter were routine. No one spoke immediately. My sister's earlier confidence gave way to calculation. Her fiancé already considering implications, he could no longer manage my parents looking at me with an unfamiliar stillness, realizing that the person they had categorized so confidently had existed far outside their understanding for a very long time. I did not clarify, justify, or explain. I did not need to. The truth had not arrived dramatically, it had asserted itself quietly, undeniable, not because it was loud, but because it had always been there, operating independently of their expectations. The aftermath unfolded without spectacle, exactly the way real consequences usually do. Tiffany did not lose everything overnight, but the trajectory she had counted on quietly bent away from her. The role she had celebrated became provisional, then constrained, framed as a trial period that required additional oversight, additional reporting, additional approval. projects she expected to lead were reassigned under the justification of balance and risk management, and the visibility she once enjoyed narrowed into measured exposure. No one accused her of incompetence, yet no one treated her as untouchable anymore, and in corporate America, that shift alone can define an entire career phase. Brian Scott felt the change ripple through his professional network almost immediately. Conversations that once flowed easily became formal requests that had been implied now required documentation, and a firm that had shown strong interest chose another legal partner without explanation. He was not blacklisted or reprimanded, but the buffer he relied on vanished, replaced by neutrality that forced him to operate without assumptions of goodwill. In his field, credibility is sustained by discretion, and discretion erodes quickly when association raises questions, even unspoken ones. Philip and Elaine faced consequences that were quieter but more destabilizing. Their social standing did not collapse, yet it thinned. Invitations became selective conversations, more guarded, and the easy admiration they were used to receiving softened into polite distance. People listened differently, responded slower, and no longer deferred to their certainty. Friends who once echoed their opinions now changed the subject, and acquaintances who had admired their confidence grew reserved, recalculating how closely they wanted to align. They had not been exposed as malicious, only as misjudging their own authority, and that distinction mattered more than they expected. Within the family, the fracture settled into permanence. Tiffany became defensive, recalibrating every interaction, unsure whether support was genuine or transactional. Brian retreated into professional caution, avoiding visibility outside controlled environments. Philip spoke less, his statements measured, while Elaine struggled with the realization that guidance, framed as concern, had crossed into control with lasting consequences. No one confronted me directly, and no one demanded explanations. There were no dramatic apologies, no accusations, no attempts to negotiate a return to how things had been. Instead, there was distance, the kind that forms when people realize the dynamic they depended on no longer exists. I did not interfere or soften the outcome, not because I wanted punishment, but because intervention would have implied responsibility for repairing what I had not caused. The systems around them adjusted on their own institutions, responding to information networks, recalibrating trust relationships, adapting to revealed behavior rather than intention. What unsettled them most was not loss, but clarity. They understood that these were not temporary setbacks, but long-term adjustments, the natural response of environments that reward consistency and penalize entitlement without ceremony. They remained employed, functional, and respected in limited contexts, yet no longer insulated from consequence. I observed without comment, maintaining boundaries that had already been set, recognizing that proximity would only blur accountability. The outcome was not revenge in the cinematic sense, but something more familiar to anyone who understands how power actually works. Influence receding quietly when behavior no longer supports it. No one was destroyed, no one was saved, but each of them learned the same lesson at different speeds: that authority built on assumption dissolves when exposed to reality, and that dignity once withheld from others has a way of becoming difficult to reclaim. The attempts to reconnect did not stop immediately, but they became more careful, as if each message were testing how much access still existed. My parents reached out first, separately, choosing measured language, acknowledging mistakes without naming them, framing everything as concern rather than control, asking for conversation rather than forgiveness. My mother emphasized family continuity, reminding me of shared history and suggesting that distance did not have to mean disconnection, while my father focused on practicality, proposing neutral ground, structured dialogue, the possibility of redefining roles without severing ties. Tiffany followed with shorter messages stripped of confidence, alternating between apology and explanation, admitting hurt while defending pressure, insisting that none of it had been meant to diminish me. Brian Scott sent a single message, restrained and professional, expressing regret for how events had unfolded and suggesting that misinterpretation, not intent, had driven the outcome. None of them demanded reconciliation directly, but every message carried the same assumption that time, clarity, and willingness could restore what had broken. I read everything without urgency, not because I was unsure, but because the decision had already been made before the truth surfaced. When I responded, I did not revisit specific moments or argue intent. I stated plainly that contact would not continue, that explanations did not alter impact, and that apologies offered after consequence did not rebuild trust. I explained that the relationship they wanted to preserve had relied on imbalance, on authority disguised as care, and that removing that dynamic required distance, not discussion. There was no anger in my response, no accusation, only clarity, the kind that leaves no room for negotiation. I did not ask them to understand, only to respect the boundary I was setting. I did not offer conditions for future contact or suggest that time might change my position. The reply ended where it needed to end, without invitation, without ambiguity. The reactions came quickly, then slowed. Shock shifted into pleading, pleading into frustration, frustration into resignation, and eventually into silence, as it became clear that this was not a pause, but a conclusion. I did not block numbers or dramatize the separation. I simply disengaged, allowing absence to do what explanation could not. The final step was quiet and practical. I closed accounts that tied us, administratively reassigned points of contact, and removed overlap that might invite accidental connection. I left the city without announcement, not to escape, but to choose a life that no longer required defense or translation. There was no farewell conversation, no final confrontation, no moment designed for closure. I packed lightly, released what no longer belonged to me, and walked away, without looking back, understanding that endings do not require consensus to be valid. The distance that followed was not empty. It was functional, creating space where my decisions stood on their own, and my worth no longer depended on recognition. The story did not resolve with forgiveness or reunion, because resolution does not always mean repair. Sometimes it arrives through separation, through the refusal to continue cycles that have already proven their cost. I did not feel triumphant or vindicated, only settled, grounded in the certainty that boundaries are not punishments, but necessities. The door closed without sound, without drama, simply shut. And in that quiet finality, the chapter ended exactly as it needed to, without explanation, without return, and without compromise. Thank you all for taking the time to watch the video. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos.